The United States Congress is one of the most unpopular institutions in America. Only 25% of Americans approve of the job Congress is doing. While housing prices and the overall cost of living continue to rise, Americans are forced to sit and watch as elected lawmakers rake in millions of dollars using inside information. The idea of banning congressmen from trading individual stocks has become increasingly popular among Democrat, Republican, and independent voters, and the idea is picking up steam in Washington, D.C. However, like most things, attention on this topic is mainly focused on lawmakers in Congress, while lawmakers in state houses fly under the radar. No state in our country has any ban on lawmakers buying individual stocks. While that fact might not surprise anybody, you may be surprised to learn just how minimal the reporting requirements are for state lawmakers, especially here in Utah. The information you can find, however, still tells a story. And it's a story that helps explain why Utah's lawmakers seem completely indifferent towards fixing the state's housing crisis. Other than the scope of their jurisdiction, there are three main differences between federal lawmakers and state lawmakers: fundraising limits, conflict of interest reporting, and compensation. Let's start with compensation. Members of Congress have base salaries of $174,000, with party leaders making $193,000 and the Speaker making $223,000. Congress is a full-time legislature, with just a few months of legislative recess. Utah lawmakers, on the other hand, are paid $300 per day for official work, with travel per diem and mileage reimbursements. The legislature has a scheduled session lasting from January to March, with the governor having the power to call special sessions if necessary. As a result, Utah lawmakers rely more heavily on other forms of employment and compensation than members of Congress, with most holding full-time employment. Lawmakers' employment details can be found on the official Utah House and Senate websites. And if you were worried there weren't going to be enough lawyers and salesmen in the legislature, don't worry. That's pretty much all Utah has. Only 3 members officially listed real estate as their profession, but conflict of interest reports suggest many more members deliberately hide their financial interests in real estate development. For example, Senate President Stuart Adams lists his profession as simply businessman on his official Senate bio. However, reports show Adams owns or is an officer of many construction and real estate companies. And before Mike Schultz became Speaker of the House, his disclosure forms listed his employment as construction. Now it says farming and ranching. An analysis by the Salt Lake Tribune found more than 20% of Utah senators had earned their primary income from real estate and development, with nearly 50% having some type of financial interest in the industry. Unfortunately, Utah's conflict of interest laws require less transparency from its state lawmakers than what's required for federal lawmakers, so it's difficult to put an exact percentage to these figures. The Stock Act requires members of Congress to disclose securities transactions exceeding $1,000 in value within 30 to 45 days of the trade, as well as real estate assets of over $1,000 in value. This is what's helped accounts like the Nancy Pelosi stock tracker who mimic congressional trading reports replicate massive returns. Utah's conflict of interest laws, on the other hand, simply require lawmakers to file their disclosure reports once a year by January 10th, and only requires them to report individual stocks or bond holdings worth $5,000 or more at the date of disclosure. Real estate disclosure is even less transparent. Utah law requires lawmakers to provide a description of any real property they hold an ownership or other financial interest in, if they believe it may constitute a conflict of interest. If they believe? Come on, man. You can't tell me the credibility of Utah's housing market is reliant on the Scout's honor of politicians. Official disclosure reports suggest nearly 40% of the members of the Utah legislature hold financial interests in real estate and development. But who knows how high that number really is, or how deep their interests really are. So what does this mean? Ultimately, it means the worse Utah's housing crisis gets, the more lucrative business becomes for nearly 40% of the legislature. Speaking of lucrative business, the final main difference between federal and state lawmakers is the campaign finance laws regulating their elections. Individual donations to federal candidates are legally capped at $3,500 per election per cycle. Since Utah holds convention, primary, and general elections, the limit individuals could give to a single congressional or Senate candidate in a cycle is $10,500. However, these caps do not exist for legislative or governor's races in Utah, and if you dig into these publicly available fundraising reports, you can see just how much our state representatives are accepting and where their donations are coming from. For example, we can see that Wayne Harper was the top fundraising legislator in 2024, raising $173,000, just ahead of Jill Coford. However, we can also see that when counting just Utah donors, Harper raised significantly less than Coford. In fact, Harper raised the second most for legislators from out-of-state donors, behind Kirk Cullimore. Utah legislators received more than $680,000 worth of donations from out-of-state donors in 2024. That includes $215,000 from famously successful blue states like California, New York, Colorado, and Illinois, all raised to influence Utah's elections. Sift a little deeper, and you start to find more interesting nuggets, like how many donations real estate organizations made to these legislators as well. Like Lincoln Fillmore, who raised $1,000 from the Home Builders Association of Utah PAC, Dan McKay, $5,000 from the Utah Association of Realtors, and Speaker Mike Schultz, $7,500 from the Utah Association of Realtors. Now, politicians accept political donations from nearly every industry, and the real estate lobby is hardly the only one trying to influence Capitol Hill. However, in a state where nearly 40% of its lawmakers benefit from real estate holdings while average home prices skyrocket above $500,000, you would think its politicians would be more careful to avoid blatant conflict of interest violations.
Yes, Utah has a housing shortage. Some call it a crisis. So why is the state spending $2 million to tell you that?
You'd think, but this is Utah.
Here's how a newly formed organization received $2 million without going through the standard contracting process to tell you there's a housing crisis. You may have seen this ad on your television or social media feeds.
You're left feeling like you missed out, but there are straightforward solutions.
They describe the housing scarcity in Utah and tell viewers,
see how you can help to make homes more affordable in Utah at demandmoresupply.com.
This is the man leading the Demand More Supply campaign. He's Matt Lusty, Executive Director of Utah Workforce Housing Advocacy, or UWHA. In 2024, the Utah legislature gave UWHA $1 million to conduct a survey related to housing affordability, run that statewide advertising campaign, and make policy proposals.
We went into the creation of Utah Workforce Housing Advocacy knowing that housing affordability was a problem, but we did not initially think, oh, this is just a supply issue.
So you're saying it was only through the surveys or research that you discovered that there was a supply problem?
Yeah, that's right.
But we looked at the original funding request from the sponsor, Riverton Republican Senator Dan McKay. The proposal doesn't say anything about investigating why housing is expensive. Instead, it says the target audience is the people of Utah to understand and appreciate efforts to supply housing. UWHA isn't some long-established public service group. It incorporated just weeks before the 2024 Utah legislative session began. And while the state of Utah typically has processes for state business, such as bidding for contracts, UWHA did not have to compete against other bidders. Its money was approved by the legislature. Senator McKay, who made that original funding request, works in real estate development. He did not return Fox 13's messages asking for an interview. All 6 members of the UWHA Executive Board are real estate developers, have represented developers, or work in lending. Lusty works in politics, running election campaigns for Governor Spencer Cox and other Republicans.
That's right, but not just Spencer Cox. Senate President Stuart Adams, former Speaker Brad Wilson, Attorney General Derek Brown, and previously mentioned Senator Dan McKay, who sponsored the funding request, all had their campaigns helped by the guy getting millions of taxpayer funds to advertise something we already know. Sure, it could be worse, but then again, it's tough seeing your home state be mentioned in the same category as California when it comes to housing affordability. And it's tough knowing it doesn't have to be this way. Cities don't have to be drowning with traffic. Communities don't have to have high-density housing shoved down their throats. And families don't have to be struggling to find an affordable home. But the actions of many in the legislature and in the governor's mansion prove this problem isn't going to go away anytime soon. In 2025, Republican Senator Kirk Cullimore introduced Senate Bill 337, which would have introduced the Beehive Development Agency, a state organization tasked with organizing large-scale development projects across the state and whose majority of members would be appointed by the governor, Senate President, and House Speaker. It didn't pass, but who knows if they'll try that again or something worse down the road.